We often think of Formula One teams as being single entities owned by a single person or just a group of people, but sometimes the small teams have to get bigger just to survive. Pacific and Lotus were two teams that were supposed to do this in the mid-90s. Lotus had gone under at the end of 1994 and Pacific entered many woes in 1995. For 1996, Lotus was supposed to be back, merging with Pacific to create, well, not so much a super team, but certainly a joint venture. Businesses do this all the time, so why not Formula One teams? But like mentioned several times now, the 90s was a changing time. Budgets going up, TV money going through the roof, manufacturer involvement increasing. And thinking about it, the TV money was what pushed the budgets up, and if you had a manufacturer partnership, then you were sort of okay. Eddie Jordan might not have lasted much longer had he not nailed the Benson & Hedges sponsorship in time for 1996, and that money led to him being able to sign Damon Hill of all people in 1998. To have those bottomless pits of cash again. Sure, tobacco sponsorship saw F1 teams get paid off the back of addiction and death, but where else were they going to get the money from? But down the back end of the grid, things weren't looking great. Tyrrell, Minardi, teams like that, they were all slipping. Forti, gone, mid-1996. Ken Tyrrell finally swallowed his pride and sold his team at the end of 1997. And just 5 years prior, pre-qualifying had been abandoned in Formula One thanks to the demise of 3 teams in 1 year. We know about Andrea Moda, we know about my boys at Brabham, but there was a third that went under too. It was actually 4, but it's number 3 we have to keep in mind. And this is where today's story starts. It might not necessarily end in the same place, but it's certainly where it begins. In 1961, Italian businessman Gabriele Rumi took over his father's iron foundry in Brescia, in Italy. I hope I pronounced that correctly. The money that he made from owning this place allowed him to indulge in some more expensive hobbies, most notably hill climb racing. Something I'd love to have a go at myself, but I know I'll be slow as hell. And it was clear that Rumi had a passion for cars, and at the start of the 1970s, while working with cars at the hill climb events, he noticed there was a gap in the market for automotive parts. There were these companies making parts for the likes of OM and Magneti Marelli, but Rumi realised it would be more cost effective to just simply make the parts himself, and not rely on suppliers. Especially since this was the early 1970s and the oil crisis had hit. So he launched his own brand. Alloy wheels were what he began making under the name Fondmetal. I think that's how it's pronounced, I just went for a bit of, Italian flair there. 10 years later, Fondmetal, or just Fondmetal for a more English take on things, became involved in Formula One. Recipients of the wheels included Williams, Tyrrell and Ligier, and Fondmetal also sponsored the career of the Italian driver Piercarlo Genzani, as well as also becoming involved in Italian back-of-grid have-a-go heroes Osella. And by 1990, Rumi himself had become a major shareholder in Osella. Osella, as it so happens, was sliding further and further into back-of-grid obscurity. In 1989, the team had failed to pre-qualify for a vast majority of the races, and money troubles meant a downsizing to just one car in time for 1990. At the end of that 1990 season, Osella was done, and Rumi now had a Formula One team, because he now owned it. The 1991 car, the Fondmetal FA1M-E, although it was just a renamed Osella chassis, was driven by the Frenchman Olivier Guillard, at least until Rumi became bored of Olivier's reckless side and the attitude problem he had. Gabriele Tarquini was drafted in to replace him and was actually faster than Guillard, and while Olivier was struggling to pre-qualify through 1991, Tarquini was able to make the grid at every race he entered in 1992, when Fondmetal brought in an updated car. But the money was running out, and after running paid drivers in the second seat through 1992, Fondmetal as a Formula One team ended up calling it quits after the Italian Grand Prix, joining Andrea Moda and Brabham as the teams not to finish the season, although March would go under at the end of the season. Meanwhile, in exactly the same city that Fondmetal was from, another Formula One team was slowly trundling along, but somehow making it through things. Giuseppe Lucchini had got his racing break in, funnily enough, an Osella, although for him it was the Osella PA08 sports car rather than an open wheeler. In 1983, he founded a company called Brixia Motorsport, with Brixia being the old Roman name for Brescia. Again, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, and the team entered the World Touring Car Championship as well as other series. In the WTCC, they used Alfa 75 turbos, but when Alfa pulled out at the end of 1987, Lucchini decided that Formula One would be the next logical place to take things. Because that was the thing about Formula One in those days, there were quite a few Italian teams having a go. but none of them ended up being the next Ferrari. Lucchini commissioned Italian racing car maker Lola to build the cars for him, and in 1988 a new team ended up on the grid. The team was simply called Scuderia Italia, entered under the BMS umbrella, if you want to call it that. And while the team was called Scuderia Italia, the team was listed as Lola for the Constructors' Championship since Lola built the car. That was just the rules at the time, as the LaRousse team would later find out in 1990, I think it was, when they were down as LaRousse and not Lola and got excluded from the championship. Alex Caffey, who was in the only car for that particular season, was able to qualify for 14 of the 16 races. He didn't score any points, but he was qualifying, and at that point, that's what mattered. 2 cars were entered for 1989, the 1989 season having a whopping 39 entrants for races, the most in Formula 1 history. So qualifying would be the goal, because that's going to attract sponsors. Caffey stayed for 1989, and alongside him was journeyman driver and man who should get a retrospective done on him at some point, Andrea De Cesaris. De Cesaris shocked everybody by getting a podium at the Canadian Grand Prix, while Caffey scored a point for getting 6th in that same race. And this was good enough for BMS, Scuderia Italia, Lola, whatever you want to call them, to get 8th in the Constructors' Championship with the 8 points they scored. That put them above Brabham, Onyx, March, Minardi, and Ligier. Caffey left for Arrows at the end of '89, and in came Emanuele Pirro as the replacement. De Cesaris was able to get 3rd on the grid for the US Grand Prix at Phoenix, but that was as good as it got. Qualifying was fine. They made the grid for all but 2 races, and they didn't have to pre-qualify because of the good result in Canada the previous season. But finishing races, that was the hard part. Gianni Morbidelli was pulled in for the US and Brazilian races as Pirro was ill, but when Pirro got back in the car, it was an 11th at Silverstone, a 10th in Hungary, and a 15th at Estoril that were the best he could get. It was the only he could get. De Cesaris, meanwhile, only finished 2 races all year, the best of those being 10th at Monza, and got disqualified from the French Grand Prix at Paul Ricard for being underweight. With some more changes of personnel, Scuderia Italia wanted to put everything that happened in 1990 behind them. JJ Leto became the latest driver to come through the door, and he was hotly rated at the time. Meanwhile, Nigel Copperthwaite brought the new F191 car, and instead of Cosworths, the team was now running Judd engines, with Judd having their own video done on them before if you want to watch it. I think it's interesting anyway. De Cesaris had moved to the new Jordan team, and Leto managed to get another podium for the squad, this time at Imola. 8th in the Constructors' Championship was the reward, which put them once again ahead of Brabham and Ligier, as well as Lotus. In 1992, the team scored 2 points that got them 10th overall in the Constructors' Championship, but the relationship with Lola was now breaking down, and they decided to turn to Lola for the 1993 season. Scuderia Italia, now down as Lola on the Constructors' Championship result sheets, were the only team in 1993 to not run any driver aids on the car. Some teams had active suspension, some had anti-lock brakes, some had auto-shifting gearboxes. McLaren and Williams had the full English breakfast. Scuderia Italia, on the other hand, they had nothing. Not even traction control. As such, they were excluded from every vote that the teams had with the FIA over driver aids, simply because they weren't part of the, well, club, as it were. Unanimous votes were required, and they were only ever going to vote no, so there was no point in having them there. Michele Alboreto and Luca Badoa were brought in as drivers, and the performance was, well, shocking, to nobody's surprise. So much so, the FIA actually ended up changing the rules. Because of pre-qualifying being done away with in 1992 because of Brabham going under and Andrea Moda being kicked out, with Fondmetal following not long after that and then March at the end of 1992, in 1993 the amount of drivers that could start a race was lowered from 26 down to 24. This being because there were now 26 entrants, so it meant that you just had to set a lap and you got on the grid, no matter how slow you were. So the FIA had to do something to encourage performance. Now, I say this, but at South Africa, all 26 cars started the Grand Prix. The FIA was going to reduce it to 24 after that, but compromised with Scuderia Italia by making it 25 instead. That way, it would mean that every team would get at least one car to start the race, and nobody would miss out if, I don't know, cars crashed or suffered horrendous reliability so that they didn't qualify both cars, if you follow me. But when the FIA noticed that the car that failed to qualify was almost always the Scuderia Italia car, they basically said, yeah, alright then, everybody qualifies, no matter how slow they are. Despite scoring no points and not even finishing the season, Scuderia Italia finished above Tyrrell in the standings. This being because BMS's best result was 7th, while Tyrrell's was not. The team had the previous year's Ferrari engines, but even then that wasn't enough to help them out. The car itself was a bucket of bolts. It didn't have driver aids, and the finances were such that the team elected to miss the Japanese and Australian Grand Prix. But their fellow Italian backmarkers and cult heroes Minardi were also looking at the bank balance and going, yeah, this isn't good, in Italian. After a meeting between the two teams, they decided to merge, if only to keep both teams alive. BMS still had a little bit of money, Minardi still had a little bit of money. If they merged, they'd pool that money and have, well, more money. Like and subscribe for more financial analysis. Giancarlo Minardi would have 14.5% of the team. The BMS bosses in Emilio Gnutti, Giuseppe Lucchini and Vittorio Lazzini would also have a chunk, and then a company called Defendente Marnisia would have the remaining share. Again, Italian not my strong suit. I did Spanish at school. The car that Minardi had that year in 1994 wasn't too bad, all things considered, but it might have been helped along slightly by the newcomers onto the grid, being Pacific and Simtek, having cars that were just rubbish, with Pacific constantly failing to qualify as there were now 28 cars going for the 26 slots on the grid. The orange, blue and white cars actually ended up scoring points in France, Spain and Monaco. But then in 1995, with some financial investment from Flavio Briatore, the Minardi M195 was able to score a single point at the season-ending Australian Grand Prix. But there was a third player in all of this. Going back to the beginning of the video, we were looking at Mr. Rumi and his alloy wheel business. Rim stock, but without the Brummy accents. At the end of 1995, BMS actually pulled out of the partnership with Minardi and went back to sports cars. But while this was going on, Minardi still had a helping hand. Minardi didn't have its own wind tunnel, but Gabriele Rumi had actually bought the Casamaro wind tunnel in Italy, which at the time was one of the best in the world. With this newly purchased wind tunnel, Fondmetal Technologies was set up and they did some consultancy work, mostly for Mercedes DTM cars, but also worked with Benetton and Tyrrell. But with BMS out of Minardi at the end of 1995 and Briatore out at the end of 1996, it left an opening for Rumi to come back at a technical level rather than a management one. But while it might seem that Rumi was out of Formula 1 for a couple of years, he was still floating around in one capacity or another. And his name was on little bits and pieces, even if his name wasn't on there in a very overt way. Just before his team collapsed at the end of 1992, Rumi had commissioned a design of an F1 car from the company Rinland, which was not uncommon. We've just mentioned BMS going to Dallara and Lola. LaRue's also used Lola, and the Andrea Moda car was a car that Nick Worth from Simtek had designed for BMW. Most thought that the car had never been built, but it had. In 1995, another Italian have-a-go hero team in Forti joined the grid, and their FG01 car was the car that Rinland had designed for the Fondmetal team. The FG01 was what should have been the GR02 that Fondmetal would have used in 1993 if they stuck around. According to the now defunct F1 Rejects website, people thought that this 40 car was a few years out of date. It turns out they were right. So the Fondmetal stickers came off the Tyrrells at the end of 1996 and were stuck on the Minardis for 1997. Rumi actually ended up buying into Minardi in 1995 along with Flavio, and then bought Flavor Flav shares in the operation afterwards, which actually made him the majority shareholder and chairman of the Minardi Formula 1 team in 1997. And the team continued to battle on through the tail end of the 90s, culminating with Marc Gené's very popular single point at the 1999 European Grand Prix. This ensured that Minardi finished above BAR that year and won some extra prize money. But Minardi did actually come close to scoring points in 1998. Shinji Nakano and Esteban Torreira managed to get a 7th and 8th over the course of that season. And speaking of 1998, in 1997 Minardi had been using Brian Hart's V8s, but with Tom Walkinshaw buying out the company to use it as his own engine making plant, with the engines becoming Arrows branded in 1998, Minardi had to resort to using underpowered and borderline obsolete Cosworths for the 1998 season. Minardi would continue to use these Ford Zetec R engines through 98 and 99 before they were rebadged as Fondmetal in 2000. Minardi had been the Fondmetal Minardi team in 1998 and 1999 as the Alloy Wheel Company had been the title sponsor. But for the year 2000, the naming changed, with Telefonica coming on board for that year as the new title sponsor. So the engines were badged as Fondmetal so that their technical partner and owner would get some advertising as well. Sauber were doing something similar with the Petronas badged Ferrari engines that they had. But Minardi was absolutely screwed in this time. While Minardi usually opted to take one driver who was rated and another that brought money, this time they really did have to chase the cash, taking on Argentinian driver Gaston Mazzacane and the backing from the Pan American Sports Network just to keep them solvent. At the same time, the lifespan of the team was under the microscope. Sadly, Rumi had been diagnosed with cancer, and it was terminal. The Minardi car of the year 2000 was something. Highlighter yellow and blue, and in a way it kind of harked back to the 40 of the 1995 and early 1996 season, which, as we've already established, had Rumi's name on the car. Sort of. The yellow was because of the Telefonica backing, but the investment wasn't enough to get the car to where Minardi would have liked it to be. While they'd scored a point in 1999, the new millennium wouldn't bring any points at all. Although, if you look at things here, if the modern point system was in effect, Minardi would have scored at least a handful of points. Genet would have got 4 points in Australia, and Mazzacane would have got 1 in Brazil, before getting another 4 points at the Nürburgring, and more points would have been scored at Austria and also in Italy, where both cars would have scored. But the old system is the old system. You had to be in the top 6 back then, not the top 10. And I know I've mentioned this a zillion times, but this is why teams like Minardi celebrated a 6th place like they'd won the championship, even if they only got that point because everybody else crashed out. But with no points scored over the course of the 2000 season and also Rumi being as ill as he was, they had to do something or the team would collapse. In the January of 2001, the motorsport press was already writing the eulogies for the plucky underdogs that were Minardi, the team that had scored about 35 points in its entire existence and survived where so many others around them had gone under. This was also the team that helped usher in some of the Italian talent of the last 15 years, Trulli, Fisichella, Alboreto, and so on. But in the latter stages of the 2000 season, Rumi sold his shares in Minardi to PSN, Mazzacane's sponsor. But when PSN realised that running an F1 team is harder and more expensive than they thought it would be, they bailed on the whole operation, and Mazzacane and his South American Sky Sports money went to Prost instead. Which went well. So now Minardi was whatever the Italian for up shit creek without a paddle is. They had no owner, no engines, and no drivers. But in stepped Australian businessman Paul Stoddart, who owned European Aviation, a company whose logos had been seen on Tyrrell and Arrows cars in recent years. He bought some initial shares in the team, and then mere weeks before the 2001 season started, he took over completely. One of the drivers installed in that car for the year was some Spanish teenager called Alonso, and Stoddart also used the backing of Malaysian driver Alex Young to get through the season. Talent in one car, cash in the other. Just like Minardi always had been. As such, Minardi continued to the end of the 2005 season, which is a period I've covered in full on the channel before. But at the same time, this story makes you realise just how incestuous Formula 1 is. You've got this team called Osella, which gets bought into by this businessman called Rumi. Rumi runs Osella as a new team named after his business for a couple of years before it goes bankrupt, and then he ends up buying a wind tunnel that he loans out to one of his rival teams, Italian rival teams that is. Meanwhile, you've got another Italian team that struggles and ultimately goes into financial ruin, and merges with a rival team to ensure that both teams can stay afloat. And when that team decides that they've had enough, the owner of the wind tunnel picks up the pieces and ends up owning what was his rival team only, 4 years ago? Something like that? One guy buys a team, loses it, and then buys into another team later on. It's crazy, as confusing as all that sounds. But sadly, Rumi would pass away in the May of 2001. The Minardi team, though, was saved, and despite the fast turnaround, Stoddart managed to keep his promise of getting the cars onto the grid for the first round in Melbourne. It wasn't a season of points, but it at least ensured that a cult favourite Formula 1 team remained on the grid. Now, it's owned by Red Bull, and has since won 2 races. This story is something that just would not happen in today's Formula 1. The teams are too valuable and buying in is just way too expensive, so unless Christian Horner decides he's going to buy one of the teams out, we're probably never going to see a story like this ever again. So then, a look at just how incestuous Formula 1 can be. I'm not sure I'll be able to use that as a title without getting demonetized, but I'll figure something out. But it is interesting to see how people can end up doing one thing and end up falling into another thing, and how things end up changing hands or having somebody end up moving from place to place. So with that said, If you've enjoyed today's crazy look through the history books, then do give the video a like so I know a good job was done and or it was interesting for you. And if you're not already, get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the mad lads over at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help pay the bills or help with the picture purchasing stuff, there's a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and anything else you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks for one and done donations and memberships so you can do Patreon but without going to Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.